Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, almost exactly 230 years and 2 months ago, William Pitt the Jr., then the Prime Minister of Britain, rose in the House of Commons in order to address it. It was exactly on 18th November 1793, and what he said there was that determination is an argument used, a plea for every infringement of human liberty. And then he said that determination is the argument of tyrants and the belief of slaves. From somewhat different side, at the same problem of the relationship between historical determination and human freedom of choice, was looking quite recently a person, the South African writer, whom I consider to be one of the greatest living philosophers among novel writers and one of the greatest novel writers among contemporary philosophers, Koetsche said the following, that he just expressed his amazement, his incredulity, his lack of comprehension, saying that the question of why life must be likened to a race, he wrote it in his diary of a bad year, published in 2009. So, why life must be likened to a race, or of why the national economies must race against each other, rather than going for a comradely jog together for the sake of the health, is not raised. This question is not raised. But surely, he says, God did not make the market. God or the spirit of history. And if we human beings made it, can we not unmake it and remake it in another form? Why does the world has to be killed or be killed gladiatorial amphitheater rather than, say, a busily cooperative beehive or an anthill? Indeed, why? That's the question with which philosophers are struggling and historians are struggling. Professor Marek Tam can tell you much more about it than I possibly could, because he's really one of the foremost experts in the field. I can only make some side observation on it and share, some sort of a statement of my personal beliefs about the matter. I think that the question is quite a real one. What is the relationship between us being determined and being made up and us being the makers? Well, the situation is quite complex, and every attempt to rewrite it or represent it, as Professor Tam so nicely explained here, is doomed to, well, at the best, at the utmost, a partial truth, not a solution of the question, but rather indication of the complexity of it, asking questions more than answering them. Well, making history at as Karl Marx long ago pointed out, is a human business. Humans make their history, but he immediately answered, they don't make it under conditions of their choice. So our choosing of what to do and how to do it is confined by the fact that the choosing itself is beyond our choice. We can't refuse to make choices. We can't avoid them. Whatever we do, by doing or by desisting of doing, by making things or withdrawing from active participation, is a choice. It's a choice which leaves a trace of the future history. I don't believe that there are really the radical ends of eras, the definite ends of eras, and the real, genuine new beginnings, new starts, as we very often think, trying against our ability to put a logic in a essentially not logical, not pre-designed, not predetermined, not pre-mapped, not pre-planned development of events, and represent in the sense of making meaningful what in the direct raw presence, before representing what seems to be devoid of meaning, seem to be a chaotic agglomeration of incidents and coincidences. So there is a dialectic, intertwining of continuities and discontinuities in history. I think that the closest allegory or metaphor for history when looked on retrospectively is that it is a palimpsest with many layers of brushwork. There is one on the very top, on the surface, but it's just a veneer. From beneath it, the older layers of the brushwork of paint can be gleaned. Therefore, every point in history, I think, it is the best approach to it, should be approached namely as something not fully determined. Not fully determined, nevertheless, not fully free either. It is not the determination against freedom, it is rather the intermixing of the two and interrelationship between the two, the so to speak, the relationship of power of one over another, which is really the fact of the matter. But still, having said that rather banal, having made it rather banal statement, the question is whether, despite of this similarity of situation, which is to some extent, the inescapable condition of humanity, whether there are time spans which differ from each other by the relationship between the two, determination and the freedom of choice. Now here is where interregnum comes into reasoning. Interregnum, it is just the proposition how to approach it, the same way as Ketze or William Pitt Jr. Said, they propose, in fact, the kind of a telescope or microscope with which you should arm yourself when you approach the task of making meaningless the meaningful and illogical logical. The interregnum is a good concept, in my view, to describe the situation in which we are. The specific, the defining features of this very relatively novel in our own lifetime period of history. What is interregnum? Interregnum was first used, the idea was first used, as far as I know, by the ancient Rome historian Titus Livius, when he described the situation after the sudden, unexpected, every death is unexpected, but this was particularly unexpected death of Romulus, the first king of Rome, legendary king of Rome. He ruled Rome for 38 years, and ladies and gentlemen, at that time, 38 years was the average expectation of life of the average Roman citizen, which means that when he died, most of the Romans did not remember living without Romulus, and without his daily instruction, daily command, daily recommendation what to do with their life. Suddenly he disappeared. And he really disappeared. The legend has it that he didn't die, but was raised alive to the heaven directly. That was the first historical story about entering heaven directly from earth. And that is a good illustration of the shock which the Romans could experience at the sudden disappearance of their only source of wisdom. There were no competitive sources, no other authorities. That was long before the invention of internet, as you know, World Wide Web, and so on. Not even Gutenberg printing press were yet invented. So it disappeared. They didn't know what to do. Titus Livius describes this period as a period of disorientation, uncertainty. That was the major characteristics of the time of Interregnum. And it lasted as long as until Numa Pompilius, the next king of Rome, was acclaimed, and he entered the same palace which was occupied by Romulus, and from the same palace promulgated the new laws, different from those which were left by Romulus. So a situation of uncertainty. Antonio Gramsci, more than 2,000 years later, reformulated, generalized, or I would say extrapolated the meaning of interregnum, the specific event between two kings, into a wider category, more widely applicable to study history category. Interregnum, according to Antonio Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, is a situation in which the old ways of having things done don't work any longer, but the new ways of doing things, of handling them, has not yet been invented. So it is, one would say, a situation in which uncertainty and the humiliating feeling of impotence, of the inability of having things properly done, are mixing together. If you just imagine yourself coming from Mars, suspending your cosmic ship somewhere in between, looking from there on Earth and seeing people running, then you would see that they know clearly from what they are escaping, but they are not certain about where to they are going. They are meandering around, they are trying right, trying left, trying straight on, trying something back, but there is no clear direction in their running. And I think that is a good description of the state of interregnum. We know much better what we don't know, what we are aggrieved against, what we are repelled by, than what is the dreamed of, imagined as close to perfect vision to which we want to achieve, and which we want to arrive at. And the second issue, very closely connected, also characteristic of state of interregnum, is the question that the most difficult query which confront is no longer the question what needs to be done, but the question who is going to do it. Who is going to do it? The crisis of agency. When I was a young person, I remember quarreling with my contemporaries very, very hotly about what needs to be done, what is better a way to go to than the other, than the next one. But I don't remember quarreling who is going to do it. The situation for everybody, whatever your political, ideological denomination could be, the absolute certain answer to the question who, what the question is the state. The state, all powerful, having all the instruments, all the tools which are necessary in order to have things done, concentrated in its hands, sovereign on its territory, it will do the job. Immediately after the collapse of credit in 2007, people were comparing the present crisis, which we are still inside, with that crisis in the late 30s, collapse of banking system, collapse of economy, massive unemployment, redundancies, suicides, and so on. And however, between that situation, that Great Depression of the late 1930s and the present day crisis, there is one big difference, because no one asked then the question who is going to pick up out of the trouble. Of course, the rulers must do it. Whoever sits in the presidential or prime minister palace has the skills, has the instruments, weapons, and should have also the will to do the job. As you know, it resulted in two greatest totalitarianisms in history, the Soviet and the Nazis, but also resulted in New Deal of Roosevelt, the American president. It also resulted finally, after the war, in the course of the glorious 30 years after the end of the 30 years long war of Europeans conducted on the other continents, on the whole of the globe. Well, the period when there were inklings and there were widespread beliefs. You don't remember that, but I remember it very clearly. I lived through it, when people believed that finally the rampant inequality of chances, of opportunities has been taken under control. There is on full employment around the next corner. We are approaching society in which people will have the ideal combination, unheard of but always dreamt about, combination of security of their social position and freedom, and personal freedom. That was the period of social state, called sometimes welfare state, period when it seemed to be that the end of, that the state did what it was expected to do all along. Made the country hospitable for human life. It ended in 1970s, as you know. The social state, as conceived originally, suddenly appeared unsustainable. There were simply not enough resources to sustain it. Now, many other things happen around. I will speak about them a moment later, which made the belief in all omnipotence of the state as all-powerful force to do things properly and better than before, that has been eroded. The unemployment returned with vengeance. There was a rampant inflation, and it was quite clear that the state, whatever it does, it tries to do, cannot manage the affairs. Well, the first big crisis, but on the horizon there was another powerful agent which will take it over from the state and do things properly, which the state could not do. This in new, trusty, magical curer or healer of the social ills was the invisible hand of the market. The market will do it. The market will do it. Politicians failed, parliaments failed, governments failed. Now the market just let it be as it is its nature, and it will take care of the old ills. Well, we had after that another 30 years. Another 30 years, this time of consumerist orgy, moved, as we now see it clearly, by the very ingenious invention of transforming the ordinary people, not living on borrowed money, into permanent debtor, taking loans and repaying the loans of the bank. In other words, much more simplified, the 30 years of living beyond means, living on unearned money, and the consumerist orgy of these 30 years was just a manifestation of this joy, of this delight, of this return to paradise which we went through. Now came 2007, collapse of credit, repossession of houses, bought on credit, massive losses of jobs, redundancies, things like that. The new regime of enforced austerity, and the uncritical trust in the wonderful ability of markets, shared the fate of the uncontrolled trust in the wonderful ability of the state. And that is how our interregnum today differs from other periods of uncertainty and crisis. We don't have another savior waiting in the wings to replace those who went bankrupt. We don't believe already in state. The erosion of trust in the ability of state is quite amazing. And going on very fast. And we don't believe also in wondrous ability to cure social ills in the hands of the market. Professor Kania, who is fortunately present with us, was in charge for many, many years, longitudinal, 30 years long or even more, study of European values. And in her findings, you can glean all the facts of the matter, how Europeans, us Eastern Europeans, post-communist bloc and so on, how we felt affinity with the new savior Europe, coming to our help, and how this trust and this confidence put into its activity was diminishing over the years, and probably is falling again now. The reaction to the crisis, instead of bringing us together, holding together, just understanding our mutual interdependency, resulted in centrifugal rather than centripetal tendencies. We are withdrawing more and more into the memory of the past, the independent sovereign state with which you can identify. But what Professor Kania's findings also show, and I will try to elaborate on her finding a little bit later, is that the new agents are looming on the horizon, which are neither the nation state nor the anonymous, abstract, uncontrolled politically market. So we are really in the state of interregnum in this sense, knowing what we are escaping from, knowing what we don't want anymore, but not necessarily sure of the road map which should be followed in order to do that. I'd like now briefly to trace the history of the present situation, how it happened, how it came to it. And I would like to start with 1555, when to Augsburg, one of the German towns, came the representatives, plenipotentiaries of the ruling, most powerful dynasties of Europe, in order to find a formula which will put an end to awful things which was happening at that time to Europe, Reformation, counter-Reformation, religious wars, millions of people murdered, the millions of acres of destroyed, devastated fields, epidemics, allegedly, according to some historical computations. There were areas in Europe afflicted by the ongoing religious wars in which 50% of the population was murdered or died because of the epidemic. So it was a very urgent question. A formula of peaceful coexistence between religions should be found. And it was coined, this formula, in Augsburg in 1555. The formula known to you probably, cuius regio eius religio, and religio, and that means whoever rules decides the fate of his subjects, or putting it more simply, decides in which God his subjects should believe. The formula was not immediately put in operation. There were still, you know, the burden of the recent past and the animosities and the mutual hatred did not subside that easily. People were used already to live under constant war with neighbors and brethren conditions, and they felt ill at ease at the prospect of the cohabitation, peaceful cohabitation with people of different faiths. Anyway, it lasted almost 100 more until 1648, when this time in Münster and Osnabrück, two other German towns, representatives of the ruling dynasties gathered, and they really reached the agreement between all the participants of the conference, which went into records under the name of Westphalian settlement. And I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we are still living in the shadow of this settlement, and that is, to a very great extent, one part of the responsibility for the present interregnum. Because what Westphalian settlement was about one thing in particular, and that is the territorial nature of sovereignty. One issue was that the ruler is a sovereign, namely he or she can decide whatever his or her will tells him to do. Well, the Otto Schmidt, Carl Schmidt, sorry, you probably know the name, the flirting with Nazis, political philosopher of 20th century, represented very nicely this idea of sovereignty. The absolute right of the sovereign to decide the law and the exceptions from the law, guided solely by his decisionist prerogative. And the second point was the connection of the sovereignty with territory. Within these boundaries, on this territory, confined within these boundaries, this religion obliged everybody who found his or her place there. Territorial principle of sovereignty. Well, in forthcoming centuries, this formula cuius regio eius religio imperceptibly changed one element in it. Namely, instead of religio, a new word appeared, natio, cuius regio eius natio. But that was the change of idiom, not the change of the principle. Principle remains as it was. Principle remained, A, sovereignty, namely every interference from outside of the boundaries is a transgression, is abnormality, is an act of aggression which ought to be fought against, tooth and nail. And finally, also the idea that there is some sort of unwritten codicil collateral addition to the Westphalian Agreement, namely the grounds for universal solidarity of rulers in defending each one of them right to rule absolutely, sovereignly the territory of his or her realm. And that applied very well to the process of nation building, which took place in Europe starting from late 17th century and up to the middle of 20th century in Europe. But of course it was transplanted to all other continents by the episode of European colonialism and imperialism. You look at contemporary map of Africa, you see the outcome of it. Very often the boundaries are just the straight lines drawn by the generals of the warring armies, European conducting the wars on African continents, and ignoring all natural processes of nation formation, the cutting in half or in several pieces the territory inhabited by people of the same tribe, of the same language, of the same historical tradition, and so on. The principle that the highermost unit of human togetherness, of human integration into a totality is the nation state. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, presiding over the Versailles Conference, they made out of it the general rule of human cohabitation on Earth. General principle, the nation having its own state, state being a nation's state. Hannah Arendt was memorably appalled by this decision, saying that it is a recipe for genocide and mutual murder, that places, she said, which are belts of mixed population like Balkans or Southeastern Europe, that is a recipe for disaster. And it proved to be a recipe of disaster, but nevertheless it remains in force. When United Nations were called into being after the disaster of Second World War, or rather the next installment of the 30 years long war of Europeans, it was instructed, this United Nations, as of its main task to defend tooth and nail untouchable, indivisible sovereignty of every state on its own territory. Fight against aggression, which was considered to be territorial aggression, which was considered to be, after the experience of Second World War, as the reason, as the cause of all ills in which Europe felt. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the problem is that this territorial sovereignty, in all this later period, which I already briefly and very superficially described, was in fact becoming more and more an illusion. We are living in a globalizing world, and that means very simply that whether we like it or not, whether we do it deliberately or whether we are just the object of unpredicted, unplanned turn of events, we are now all dependent on each other. The formula of nation-state served very well the idea of territorial independence of nation. It fails, it is failing still, and it will probably fail ever more gruesomely the task of tackling the situation of global interdependence. Sovereignty, more and more an illusion. What does it mean? That the state loses its ability, genuine ability or putative, real ability or at least hope for ability of effective collective action, of serving the interests expressed by the population of their countries. Why? In order to act effectively, state needed to have two things. One is power. What is power? I prefer rather in this context to use more exact translation of Max Weber's famous political formula, Macht, and I would like to speak about might, pouvoir, Macht, ability to do things, to have things done. And politics, the second instrument. Politics means the ability to decide which things ought to be done. Ability to have things done, and ability to decide which of many possible alternative things should be pursued and done. Now, the two things were embraced in the hands of the government of the sovereign country for several, dozens, perhaps even centuries. I want to enter the quarrel. There were times when it worked better and times when it worked worse, but the long-term tendency was quite clear. The separation and finally divorce between two inhabitants of the national household, power and politics. They were living together, and the very, very widely spread conviction was that their marriage was made in heaven and no human power can dissolve it. Now suddenly there was a separation and divorce. Power evaporated from the level of nation state to a very great extent, not entirely, but to a very great extent, into what Manuel Castells, the Spanish sociologist, calls the space of flows, cyberspace out there, extraterritorial space, not confined to any particular territory. State, a space where everything can be done without any political constraint. That is the habitat of the power emancipated from political control. Politics-free space. On the other hand, we have politics which is as local as it used to be in the 19th century, and is suffering of the perpetual deficit of power. So it can't deliver on its promises. It can't deliver on its promises. It's not the question of corruption, short-sightedness, stupidity of politicians. It is not the question of the wrong political program of one party or another. It is the question of discrepancy between the tasks, grandiosity of the task, and the smallness or inadequacy of the tools, of the instruments of action. Deprived of a good deal of its power, of its might to do things, dependent so much on forces outside of its own control, the state government struggle in vain with trying to hold down to the wishes of the electorate, which brings them into power and can unbring them, take them away, deprive them of power if they don't meet their promises, if they don't deliver on their promises. Now that is the substance, that is the crisis of agency, that is the foundation rather of the crisis of agency to which I referred at the beginning. The divorce between power and politics. Divorce between power and politics. Weakened, the state has to resign, surrender quite a number of very important functions which still half a century ago it defended tooth and nail as its own monopolistic prerogative. It has to get rid of them. It simply cannot carry the burden. It is overcharged with expectations and much, much beyond the ability of the instrument of action which it possesses. So, what we hear about is, first of all, the trend of privatization, contracting out to market forces functions, which even the most delicate, the most subtle, the most intimately connected with the national identity functions which the nation state previously tried to handle. So some functions are moved sideways to the unpolitical and politically uncontrolled market. The others are, as it is called in contemporary language, idiomatics, subsidiarized, leaked down. To where? Well, to the space, very indefinite, very strange space, called by Anthony Giddens life politics, area of life politics. Area of life politics, what does it mean? That means the area in which you, everybody here present in this room, every individual is his or her own parliament, government, and Supreme Court. You have to manage all the issues. As Ulrich Beck very nicely put it, we individuals are now expected to individually find individual solutions to socially produced problems. We are all, in this sense, individuals de jure. De jure, we are by decree individuals, because if we fail, if we fall into indolence, into misery, it is our fault. We were not trying hard enough, we were work shy, we were impotent or whatever, untalented, there is something wrong with our psychic power or whatever. It is referred back to our own failure. So we are individuals de jure. We bear officially, by decree, full responsibility for our individual fate, and if you can't cope, if you can't tackle problems because they are social, global in their origin, well, the reasons, the causes of that can be always found in our own misdoings, undoings. But the problem is that from individual de jure to individual de facto, there is a long way, and however hard we try, the individual means prove to be, in great majority of cases, simply not to the measure of the grandiosity of the purposes which they should be applied to. Discrepancy, lack of mutual adequacy of the two. So, we are in a situation of the crisis of the agencies, which are, as I mentioned before, allegorically, the brushwork which can be gleaned easily from underneath the veneer of the writer's brushes. And we are still left with the organs, state organs, sovereign state organs, as the only units, only entities in which we can invest hope of doing things better. The trouble is that it is unable to acquit itself properly with the task. So, We are, ladies and gentlemen, in a situation, I'm sorry, I will quote again these two hot-headed youngsters from Rhineland, Marx and Engels. They wrote manifest, if you remember, it was called Communist Manifest. If they wrote a similar manifest today, I guess, I can't vouch for that, but I guess that they started from saying, a spectre hovers over Europe, the spectre of indignation. We have the Movimiento Los Indignados in Spain, we have the movement Hesse described by called us to be indignant. We have repeated attempts to make an Arab Spring. We are waiting for Arab Summer. It's not coming, but nevertheless Arab Spring did come. At some point we had occupied Wall Street, noticed by all journalists and all TV stations in the world, apart from Wall Street itself, which didn't notice that it was occupied and goes on at its well. Why I'm talking about that is simply to show you that there is showing of tendency to find alternatives to the inherited extant ways of acting. The manifestation of realization that the old ways of doing things do not work any longer. There is an urgent need to find something to replace it. The movement of the indignant is one. It is a laboratory of experiments. They are trying one way or the other of alternative acting. There are, by some people anyway, great hopes attached to the new technology. As very often in history of humanity, we having gone bankrupt ourselves and failed in our task, we reinvest our hopes into technology. We couldn't do it, but technology will. In this case, it is the technology of electronics and informatics. If everybody has access, direct access, unmediated access to public sphere, then out of these individual clickings, some sort of solution which is general and genuine and leading exactly to the kind of society which we all want, consciously or subconsciously, will be achieved. We are living in the age of experimentation, indignation, experimentation. I don't have answers to the questions I was raising here, but I will quote Hannah Arendt once more. She emphatically said that she is not obliged to disperse the clouds which she gathered. Now, the same, I will repeat myself, ceteris paribus, of course, I'm not Hannah Arendt, I don't even try to, but what she said applies to rising questions. These are the questions: how to get rid of how to remarry power and politics again. Because it is in the quality of our human condition that we need both instruments together in order to influence, to get some visibility at least of control over our own fate and over development of history. Now, so whatever we do, and whoever will be going to do it, we have the same need in front of us. This issue must be handled, remarrying of power and control and politics, now living in separation. Well, there are all sorts of proposals. I would like to bring, well, it's time to finish, I'm afraid. I would like to bring to your attention one proposition, a very interesting one, by Benjamin Barber. I don't know whether you already came across his book published last year, and the book is called If the Mayors Ruled the World. If the Mayors Ruled the World. Well, half joking, but half serious question, because what it suggests is that the nation states abominably and definitely failed their task. They proved really what I said before, incapable to handle the situation of interdependence. They are instruments made to defend independence, separating, drawing boundaries, and what is our problem today is how to live humanly in the world in which the boundaries are weaker and weaker by the day. So the state is not a solution. As far as the lowest level, namely the level of life politics is concerned, it is quite clearly, quite evidently incapable to do the job left to its own devices. Without things like interhuman solidarity, coming together, walking shoulder to shoulder, devising joint shared programs and so on. The only level of human integration, he says, I'm saying that on his responsibility, is the intermediate level, and that's precisely the modern cities. You know that for the first time in history, already majority of humanity lives in urban environment, in cities. And as far as the so-called developing world is concerned, 70% of the population live in big cities. So it is not just the question of minority making its voice audible, it is the question of emerging majority of humanity trying to find solution in its own conditions of existence. Now, cities, ladies and gentlemen, are in a situation which is characterized by two phenomena. On the one hand, they are the dustbin where all the problems globally created are disposed on, like, you know, problems of pollution, problem of used resources, problem of massive migration, which is a global phenomenon. It is not caused by the resident of the city. It simply happens to them because of the things which happen far away from reach of their own influence. So they are the final destination of problems which are constantly created, produced, reproduced by the global forces beyond political control. On the other hand, cities are, ladies and gentlemen, laboratories in which the ways of living permanently with difference and cooperating, not just cooperating despite the differences, separating people, differences cultural, differences linguistical, differences historical, traditional, ideological, whatever, but actually benefiting from their differences by learning from each other about the experience which they personally didn't go through, and therefore learn something new, something which may prove beneficial. It was overlooked. Now it can be applied, and so on. At the same time, it is a laboratory in which the ways of dealing with the complexity of the situation can be successfully dealt, put in place. Because if you go, for example, to London, one of the big cities which I know from personal scrutiny, allegedly there is more than 70 diasporas living together in one city. Diasporas linguistical, ethnical, from the point of view of place of origin, religious. There are streets on which you have on one street in London you can find a Catholic church, a Protestant church, a Methodist chapel, and Jehovah Witnesses, meeting hall, and mosque and synagogue, all in one street, without a trace of Huntington's clash of civilization. Because who meets there on the street? They are not civilization. They are meeting the neighbors. Some of them are nasty, some of them are very pleasant. Some are very egoistic, some of them are very helpful. Some of them beat their wives and make a lot of noise. Some others are careful parents and loving fathers. So their estimation and criteria of cohabitation with them is pulled down from the heights of abstract clashes of civilization to the level manageable by old-fashioned means like neighborhood, proximity, meeting together, working in the same place, fusion of horizons, Hans Maria Gadamer dreamt of. Now that's already happened there, silently, without much hullabaloo, but nevertheless quite significantly it does mention. There is some place, the only place, suggests Benjamin Barner, in which the separated historically by Ferdinand Tönnies Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft meet. They are together. That's exactly the kind of size of cohabitation and the density, very important, physical proximity of cohabitation, which allows you to combine the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft requirements of togetherness. That's one of the propositions. I'm not suggesting to you that it's the last word of science. It is just hypothesis which needs to be closely scrutinized and checked and put to the test. But nevertheless, I mentioned it like the propositions before, where to allocate your trust, what to invest your hope in. It is one example of the inner tendency which I expect to magnify, to strengthen over the time. Tendency to look desperately and urgently for alternative ways of doing shared life. Alternative ways, alternatives. And that's something which sounds revolutionary, really, because what is involved here is nothing less than just getting slowly free from inherited frames of perception, which we all use. We don't have anything else to use, and try to elaborate new frame, new cognitive frames, new set of concepts with which to describe human condition and also the ways of changing it to the better in an organized and effective way. Thank you.